Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by commending those honourable and right honourable members who have secured this debate and thanking you for allowing it. Can I also pay tribute to the stamina of my honourable friend from North East Fife and others of my colleagues who last night assured that you would have ample time to consider the response to the original application. Mr. Speaker, later today, we begin 5 days of debate on possibly the most important peacetime decision this Parliament will ever take. Today also, Ofsted has described the government's treatment of thousands of vulnerable school children in England as a national scandal. We have a major investigation into alleged profiteering with funeral companies. We've had reports from a UN Special Rapporteur and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation highlighting the appalling poverty that exists in this, one of the wealthiest economies in the world. What's that got to do with the motion before us just now, Mr. Speaker? Because the only reason that we are allowed to discuss those things openly and without fear, indeed the only reason we're allowed to know most of those things, is because the power of the state to stop us from knowing is tempered by the rights of a democratically elected Parliament. Not tempered nearly enough, in my humble opinion. The Parliament is not democratically enough elected, in my humble opinion. But we do have an elected Parliament to hold back on the excesses of the state, to hold back on the excesses of the government. And that is what today's motion is all about. A Parliament of 650 people, each one of us entrusted to exercise sovereignty on behalf of those who sent us here. A contempt of this Parliament is a contempt for the fundamental principle of the sovereignty of the people. A contempt of this Parliament is a contempt for the people. A government that seeks to place itself above the express will of this Parliament is a government in contempt of the people, and it is a government that has already taken a dangerous step down the road from democracy towards dictatorship. And today's debate is not about the rights and wrongs of the original motion as presented to the House on the 13th of November, because astonishingly enough, the time for debate on those questions was the 13th of November. So let's not spend time today on questions of convention and precedence, of confidentiality of legal advice and of when that confidentiality should be waived. The time for that debate has gone. The time for opposition to the terms of that motion was when you, Mr. Speaker, called the question. And at that point, the government instructed its members to do nothing. The government instructed its members not to oppose that motion. I welcome the degree of humility they're shown in now admitting that they got it wrong. But the government having got it wrong is not an excuse for the government unilaterally to seek to change the wording or the meaning behind a decision, a binding decision that has been made by this Parliament. The government seem to have decided they can change that meaning. They've got the audacity to come back here yesterday and today and tell Parliament that they, and not Parliament, know what it was that Parliament decided and know what it was that Parliament meant when they took that decision. Mr. Speaker, they are placing themselves above Parliament. They are placing themselves in contempt of Parliament. And as for the legal position document published yesterday that was going to fix it all, that could hardly have been more patronising if they'd had pictures to colour in and rejoin the dots puzzles every so often just to keep us interested. It was not a legal position by any accepted definition of those terms. It was an attempted sop, possibly at some of their own MPs, who I know are in a very difficult position just now, struggling between their understandable loyalty to their government, to their party, to individual ministers, and their overriding loyalty to the people and to this Parliament. And as the right honourable member for Holborn St Pancras has pointed out, the government have made a habit of not turning up if they think they're going to lose. Maybe the problem is they get so used to being allowed to ignore the views and the opinions of Parliament, they forgot that sometimes Parliament takes decisions that they are not allowed to ignore. Maybe that's why they're so upset now. Maybe it's because alongside the issues about what and should not be made available to members of Parliament or to the public, maybe it's because this decision has laid bare the incompetence at the heart of a government that doesn't even know the basics of parliamentary procedure. I'll give way here.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I'm just wondering if this commitment to openness now means that he will be asking the Scottish legal officer to publish all of her advice in the Scottish Parliament in future?
Yes, because
And the relevance of that in this debate.
Mr. Speaker, I have absolutely no doubt that if the Parliament that represents the sovereign people of Scotland gives a binding direction to the elected government of Scotland, the elected government of Scotland will comply with that binding direction. No such binding direction has been given. But let's not, Mr. Speaker, let's not try to deflect attention from the clear and blatant contempt that has been committed against this House with completely false accusations of contempt elsewhere. Mr. Speaker, we have a government who are behaving like a football team that doesn't turn up for friendlies if they think they're going to get beat. And then they discover they've missed a cup final and they've forfeited the tie with a notional 3-0 score. They're now back here not only being asked to be allowed to replay the final, but they're complaining that the score's void because the 3 notional goals would all have been offside if there had been anybody there to defend them. But Mr. Speaker, we're not talking about a game of football with trophies at stake. We're not talking about the sanctity or non-sanctity of the confidentiality of legal advice. We're talking about the most fundamental principle. We're talking about the most fundamental principle that governs our nations. The principle that Parliament can tell the government what to do, not the other way around. And this is not just some temporary individual aberration. It's part of a pattern of government attempts to keep Parliament out of this altogether, restoring sovereignty to Parliament by keeping Parliament out of its own sovereignty. They went to the Supreme Court to stop us having any say on the triggering of Article 50, and they lost. They did their damnedest in here to stop Parliament having any say in the withdrawal agreement, and they lost. They spent thousands of pounds of our money trying to stop a group of Scottish parliamentarians from finding out whether or not Article 50 can be unilaterally revoked, and they lost. The European Court almost certainly now will find that it can be. And I want to pay tribute to the parliamentarians from 5 political parties and 3 national parliaments who brought that decision to the court. I believe that what they have won will prove to be a pivotal victory. But it does raise a question that's too important to be treated as rhetorical, and it raises a question that's highly pertinent to the substance of today's debate. What kind of government goes to court to stop its own citizens from knowing that the government has legal powers but has chosen not to use them? What legitimate reason can there be for a government to want its people to believe that something is legally impossible when the government has already got its own legal advice telling them that it is perfectly possible? Mr. Speaker, I refer to this morning's preliminary opinion from the Court of Justice of the EU as simply another example of this government's attitude that the path chosen usually unilaterally by the government is the only one worthy of consideration, and that nobody is even allowed to know that other paths might be possible. They've got their priorities completely wrong, Mr. Speaker. They repeatedly tell us, and the Leader of the House said often enough again in her comments, that their ultimate duty is to act in the public interest. But in fact, we have a government that demands that Parliament and the public act at all times in the government's interests, and that is not the same thing at all. The government has taken on itself the right to decide what's in the public interest, not the Parliament that holds sovereignty on behalf of the public. The government declares itself to know better than Parliament what is in the public interest. The government places itself above the decisions of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, the government places itself in contempt of Parliament. Early next year, we'll see the 370th anniversary of the day when a Crown King of Scots was executed just a few hundred yards up the road from here for defying the will, not of this Parliament, because this Parliament didn't exist then, but of one of its predecessors. Now, I don't think anyone's suggesting a similar fate for those who are found in contempt of this Parliament, but we should be under no illusions about the gravity of what we're discussing. And we should be under no illusions as to how the mockery from the Conservative benches is being perceived by those who believe that this Parliament should actually be allowed to tell the government what to do. The elected parliaments of our 4 nations, for all the faults and the flaws and the imperfections and the ridiculously outdated procedures and the arcane procedures that the Leader of the House sometimes doesn't like, represent the rights of our citizens. No one has the right to wield power over the people without the consent of the people. In a parliamentary democracy, that consent is expressed through Parliament, not through the office of the Prime Minister or any other holder of the offices of state. When Parliament speaks, it speaks on behalf of the people, and the government must listen. And when Parliament instructs on behalf of the people, and the government must comply. Mr. Speaker, Parliament has spoken. The government must listen. Parliament has instructed. It has not asked, it has not opined, it has not suggested, it has instructed. The government can disagree or moan or complain as much as they like, but they must comply with that instruction of Parliament. Instead, the government seeks to defy the instruction of Parliament. They seek to defy the sovereignty of the people as expressed through their elected representatives. And it is now, Mr. Speaker, for Parliament to take the only course of action open to us, to compel the government to back down.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the House, who is always unfailingly courteous, and I pay tribute to her for that, has made some preliminary comments, and I feel I must reply to them on behalf of these benches. This deal is not in the interests of the Scots or indeed of anyone in the United Kingdom. The last 2 years have shown that the promises made by the Leave campaign are undeliverable, and all significant analysis shows that this deal will have a massive hit on the British economy, and in particular on jobs and living standards of all our constituents across these islands. The loss of freedom of movement will in particular impact very heavily on the Scottish economy. So what I would say to the Leader of the House is it's not deal or no deal. There's a third option, and the third option is no Brexit. Today, Mr. Speaker, as has been widely reported, the Advocate General of the Court of Justice of the European Union has given his opinion in the case of Whiteman and others, including myself, against the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. And that preliminary opinion has said that Article 50 can indeed be unilaterally revoked. Now, I wish to suggest, Mr. Speaker, that this ruling might have some impact on today's proceedings, and I'll explain why in a moment. Hopefully I'll get the courtesy of a hearing as others did. But for the moment, I should make very clear that the Scottish National Party will support the amendment in the name of the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Beaconsfield, and we applaud his efforts and the efforts of others to ensure that democracy is not steamrolled by this government, and that Parliament has a meaningful say in relation to what might happen in the future. Otherwise, we are generally happy with the time allocated for the debate, and we're very pleased that the UK Government has paid attention to the letter from the leaders of the opposition parties calling for amendments to be decided on before a final substantive vote, that being the usual practice in this House. However, Mr. Speaker, we do think that the UK Government should really consider pushing back the meaningful vote until we have the final judgment of the Grand Chamber of the Court of Justice of the European Union in the case which I've mentioned. It's no surprise, Mr. Speaker, to the UK Government that this decision is pending, because they've been fighting it tooth and nail for the last 8 months. But I'm very proud to say that myself, another Scottish SNP parliamentarian, 2 Scottish Greens and 2 Scottish Labour MEPs have triumphed in getting this case to the Court of Justice, and the preliminary ruling which the Grand Chamber is likely to follow. And the reason we did that, Mr. Speaker, was to make sure that parliamentarians in this House would know when they came to the meaningful vote that it wasn't, as the government would have us believe, deal or no deal, that there's a third option of staying in the European Union on the current terms and conditions, a rather good deal which we currently enjoy. And that's what the Advocate General has said today. In 80% of cases, the Court follow him, and we know that the Court have said that they will rule quickly, and the word on the street is it will be before Christmas. So I'm saying to the Government, will they consider postponing the meaningful vote until we know the decision of the Court of Justice? Because, as I said, it's come as no surprise to them that this decision was pending. Mr. Speaker, at every turn since the Brexit vote, the UK Government have sought to marginalise Scotland and the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Government put forward a series of compromises which have been ignored by this Government. And I'm very proud to say that it will be a rich irony that it is Scottish parliamentarians and the Scottish courts who are throwing this Parliament a last-minute lifeline to reverse the madness of this decision. And I say that it will be ultimately up to the public in a second vote as to whether they reverse that madness. But I very much hope, Mr Speaker, that when Scotland becomes an independent nation-state again, and when Scotland looks to take her rightful place at Europe's top table alongside Ireland and the others, it will be remembered that it was the Scots that threw this Parliament a lifeline, and indeed the whole of the United Kingdom a lifeline. And I urge the Government to postpone this vote until MPs have that vital final decision from the Court of Justice.
The Prime Minister has repeatedly referenced the 52% who voted to leave, but I'm still confused as to why she is not willing to take any cognizance of the fact that electoral law has been broken and therefore the result of the referendum cannot be trusted. Otherwise, we may as well abolish electoral law altogether. Will the Prime Minister not at least respond to the findings of the Electoral Commission?
To the Prime Minister. Mr Speaker, this feels like the fall of the Ancien regime this afternoon. But can I take her back to what I think was meant to be? Can I take her... No, I think he was there. Can I take her back to the bit that I think was supposed to be the Scotland part of this speech on devolved administrations? What the Scottish Parliament will not be interested in is ministers making day trips for a number of hours to Scotland to come over with meaningless waffle. If we are to be convinced that their views will genuinely be taken into account, what will change, because they haven't been up until this point?
You let him speak now.
The Right Honourable Member talks about an ideal situation. The Right Honourable Member was a senior member of Vote Leave. He was Foreign Secretary for 2 years. We are in this mess because of him. Does he take no responsibility?
I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for finally giving way. And he's presenting an illusion of the EU not being good for the UK. I would just ask him, does he also think Euratom is not good for the UK? And if so, can he explain to those currently waiting for cancer diagnosis and treatment where they're going to get their radioactive sources from?
Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is difficult to be here today. It is in many respects a debate that many of us wish was not happening. It is a real sorrow that I rise to respond to the Government's motion. Mr. Speaker, the reality of Brexit is now laid before us. Broken promises of taking back control from a government that is so out of control. 21 ministerial resignations, communities, countries, households divided, our politics stale, a Prime Minister fighting for her political life. Mr. Speaker, the past number of months have been filled with political drama, theatre, squabbles and chaos. From crisis to crisis, this government hangs on by a thread. But beneath all of this is the real reality, the hard, cold truth that this is a moment of self-harm in our history. History has a way of teaching us lessons, if only we would listen. At a moment such as this, I reflect on someone that we regard as an icon. Winnie Ewing, Madam McCoss, who came into this House 51 years ago for the seat of Hamilton, represented the Highlands and Islands at the European Parliament and fought hard to make sure that Scotland benefited from its membership of the European Parliament, something I can see right throughout my constituency with all the signs of projects that were funded by European money. And we had a welcome year in the European Parliament, and indeed Winnie played such an important part in the development of that institution. We've heard of the importance of Erasmus today, and it holds a special place in the SNP's heart because it was Winnie Ewing who chaired the European Parliament's European and Culture Committee on Erasmus when it was established in the 1980s. That's the legacy of someone that fought hard to make sure that all of us benefited from that European membership. And if I can contrast the approach that we've had from Europe with this place, and I want to quote from the great lady herself, time after time, on matters great and small, we are still standing on the sidelines, mutely accepting what is decided elsewhere, instead of raising our voices and making our own choices.
Hear, hear.
Scotland's much vaunted partnership of Jonah and the whale. Mr. Speaker, respect for human dignity, human rights, freedom, democracy, equality and the rule of law. These are the core values of the European Union. Values that have united, not divided us as citizens of Europe now for many years. Values that are now ingrained in our society to be cherished and protected, not discarded or eroded. I am proud and privileged to be a citizen of the European Union. Mr. Speaker, the European Union has been the greatest peace project in our lifetime. A peace project born out of the horrors of 2 world wars that ripped Europe apart. A project that has gone on to change the course of our communities and improve citizens' rights and opportunities across the continent, not just now. A project that I still believe is worth defending, and we will, on these benches, defend that. A project that has enabled our generations to travel, to work, to live and to thrive across all countries that are within the European Union. Mr. Speaker, today I come here with a heavy heart, with the deepest regret that the opportunities that I had to work in Amsterdam, but also to travel throughout Europe in my working career, to learn from the best and the brightest across Europe, will be taken from our children. Because that's what we're doing. Embracing the diversity of European culture has enriched so many of us.
Absolutely.
The exciting opportunities to live and work in Amsterdam or Barcelona or Brussels or Berlin or Copenhagen or Vienna or so many other places. So many choices and opportunities that our generation had to work and to develop friendships across Europe. Mr. Speaker, to learn from the rich diversity that Europe has to offer, to benefit from the experiences of different cultures, to form friendships with those like us who celebrated being European citizens with shared rights. The right to live and work across the EU is to be ended as a right for the next generation. Mr. Speaker, I have in the gallery today an ex-colleague from Amsterdam when I worked for a bakery ingredients company, someone whose friendship was formed out of the opportunity that I had to work in Amsterdam. Our friendship is a celebration of the success of the opportunities the EU membership gave to all of us. That right to live and work together across the EU is to be ended as a right for the next generation. That automatic right to benefit for career opportunities to be removed. Opportunities to benefit from an inclusive Europe swapped for the constraints of an inward-looking United Kingdom. I'll give way to the...
I thank my right honourable friend giving way. Most people in this chamber know that my husband is German. What not all of them will know is that his mother was Polish and his parents were not allowed to marry. The child they had together was taken from them. His mother was a forced labourer and his father was lifted by the Gestapo. And long before we ended up in this mess, he used to celebrate that in one generation he could live and work where he wanted and marry who he loved. And in one more generation, we're taking it away. It's shameful.
I mean, I thank my honourable colleague and friend for that explanation of what we are doing. Colleagues, we must reflect on where we are, and I appeal to everyone throughout this House to stop and think about that erudite explanation of what has happened in Europe over the last 70 and 80 years. Stop and enshrine the benefits of free movement of people that has enriched so many of us. It is not too late to turn back. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman, and I'm very proud to be the first ever Polish-born British Member of Parliament and celebrate the contribution that 1 million Poles have made to our country. But does he not share my concern that by offering or proposing another referendum we could be giving wind to UKIP's sails, a party which is currently withering on the vine, which is falling apart. There will be a renaissance for UKIP if we have another referendum that overturns the previous result.
Ian Blackburn. I must respectfully say to the honourable gentleman that we have to take this argument on. Migration has enriched us. Now, we come from the country of Scotland where our population has barely grown over the last 100 years, where we've gone from 4.8 to just over 5 million people. If we don't have access to free movement of people, we are not going to be able to deliver sustainable economic growth. And I say respectfully to the honourable gentleman that there are thousands of Poles who have come to work in Scotland over the course of the last few years. Let me say to all of them, to each and every one of them that may be watching tonight, you are welcome. You are welcome because of the contribution that you make to our life, to our culture, to our economy. And the thought that we would take up the drawbridge and stop people coming to participate in the growth of the future of our country is quite frankly repugnant to me. And I will fight with my colleagues to make sure that we remain an open society and we can continue to be enriched by those that want to come and live and make a contribution to our economy. They are welcome and they will remain welcome. Let me make some progress and then I will make a give way. Mr. Speaker, in April 1988, when the Single Market campaign began, one prominent speaker stated, "A single market without barriers, visible or invisible, giving you direct and unhindered access to the purchasing power of over 300 million of the world's wealthiest and most prosperous people. We are putting the European community to work for ordinary people, for cheaper airfares, for more and better services, for consumer choice and product safety." Mr. Speaker, that was Margaret Thatcher. Even Margaret Thatcher recognised that shared markets, collaboration and partnership in Europe was in all our interests. Many may be puzzled why I begin by expressing the sentiment and not directly the content of the government's motion. I do so because it's right.
Hear, hear.
It is right to remember the real loss that all of us will feel, and it's not simply the loss in this deal or any other. It's the fact that any deal will mean a loss to our economy, to our society and our children. We in the SNP have long argued and continue to believe that staying in the European Union is the best option for Scotland and indeed for all parts of the United Kingdom. And when I hear the Prime Minister say the choice if we vote down this deal or no deal is staying in the European Union, I say yes please. Because fundamentally there is no option that is going to be better for our economy, for jobs and for our communities than staying in the European Union.
That's a fact.
And it's the height of irresponsibility of any government to bring forward a proposition that's going to make its people poorer. A proposition that's going to mean that people are going to lose their jobs. And we heard earlier from the previous Foreign Secretary that it was Project Fear about jobs. But let's look at the reality. Let's look at what we already know. 1,000 jobs lost from the European Banking Authority. 1,000 jobs lost from the European Medicines Agency. Mr. Speaker, that's not Project Fear, that's the reality, and it's already happened.
Hear, hear, hear.
I will give way.
Can I commend the open nature of the speeches given, in stark contrast to the capricious and solipsistic nonsense from the former Foreign Secretary. But will he join me on the issue of EU nationals in calling on the government, even at this late stage, to drop the charge they intend to impose on EU nationals to keep rights that they already enjoy in this country right now? The cost of a passport might not be much to them, but it should be dropped as an act of goodwill.
Of course, my honourable friend is correct, and we simply should not be charging people to exercise the rights that they should have to be here. And I'll go further, because of course we're discussing rejecting this deal, but we're also ruling out no deal. But the government should make it absolutely crystal clear, in any scenario, that the rights of all our EU citizens here will be protected. But you know, there's another factor when we discuss the rights of EU citizens here, but also UK citizens in Europe. That UK citizens that are currently in Europe will only have rights to stay and live and work in that one territory. The rights that they have had up until now of living, of travelling and working throughout the European Union are to be ended. What a disgrace. And many of these European citizens, I know of people that live in Belgium but work throughout the European continent, are going to have those rights countermanded. That, Mr. Speaker, is a disgrace. Let me make some progress and I will move on. Mr. Speaker, whilst we respect that England and Wales voted to leave the European Union, we ask that the government respect that Scotland did not. However, it is clear that the UK government has no intention of respecting the will of the Scottish people, as the deal that we are asked to support will do nothing to bring harm and hardship socially, economically and politically to Scotland. And, Mr. Speaker, we must remember that this fight, this huge struggle and burden on our society that now faces us from Brexit, comes from the Tory party and the Tory party alone. The European debate was an internal battle for the Tories, and they drove it into the public discourse, into a bigger battlefield, not because of the interests of the citizens of this country, but because of the deep divisions and narrow interests within the Tory party itself, not outside of it. We know today that it does not have to be so. We know that the Prime Minister's deal will be voted down. We know it. She knows it. This House should also vote to remove no deal from the table. There is no scenario where we will be wealthier with Brexit. No government should expose its citizens to economic risk. That is what will happen with Brexit. The government's own analysis shows that to be the case. Mr. Speaker, we must stop this madness. We can go back to the people of these islands and be honest with them on the consequences of Brexit. Today, the Advocate General Manuel Campos Sanchez Bordona has advised that EU law would allow the UK to unilaterally revoke Article 50. Until the 29th of March. We can hit the reset button. That, Prime Minister, is called leadership.
On that point, will he give way?
I'll give way.
I thank him for giving way. He touched on this point earlier, but does he agree with me that actually perhaps the people who are most affected by this are UK citizens who live in the EU, where it will require 27 countries in 27 different ways to address their concerns and their issues, who are perhaps most vulnerable in what the government are seeking to impose on us?
I fully agree, and I touched on that earlier, and it just shows how this Brexit deal is a complete shambles, and we need to think again. Mr. Speaker, a future in which Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England continues to flourish side by side as equal partners. As equal partners. These words are not mine. These are the words of the Prime Minister. A Prime Minister who promised us equal partners, but her rhetoric is in ruins, as her government's record has shown time and time again. The Tories don't believe Scotland to be an equal partner, but a second-class nation, worth only of second-class treatment. Throughout the entire negotiating period, the UK government has treated Scotland with contempt. And you know, as I look around, and I can see shaking of heads, and I look at the chamber, I look in front of me. Where are the 13 Scottish Tory MPs that were to stand up for Scotland? In this debate, which is so crucial to Scotland's future, the Tories aren't just found wanting. They're simply not here. They've disappeared.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. He is making an incredibly powerful speech. Will he agree with me on a matter of respect and a matter of contempt for the Scottish people and for our Parliament? If this government and its MPs continue to treat Scotland with the kind of disrespect that we have seen throughout this Brexit process, it will only make independence for Scotland more likely and come sooner.
Good news. Well, I thank my honourable friend for that, and I will make a prediction to this Parliament that Scotland will become an independent country, and I'll say simply to the UK Parliament, keep going.
First Ambassador.
You know, since we've come here, we've had English votes for English laws, we've had the power grab that's taking place, and the people of Scotland will one day make their judgment on what is happening. Mr. Speaker, I want to make some progress because I'm aware that many other people want to speak. Throughout the entire negotiating period, the UK Government has treated Scotland with contempt. Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain, yet the will of the Scottish people means nothing, absolutely nothing, to this Prime Minister. Instead of engaging meaningfully with Scotland during this critical time, the Prime Minister chose last-minute photocalls and stage-managed events in Scotland, all smoke and mirrors, to dress up the fact that her government couldn't care less about Scotland, and we can see it tonight. The Tories think they can do whatever they want to Scotland and get away with it. They think they can railroad this deal against our will and against our interests. The mask has well and truly slipped for the Tories. Let me say this. Scotland is not a second-class nation, and our people do not deserve a second-class deal. This proposed deal is a non-starter, and a no-deal Brexit is unthinkable. That means the priority now must be to stop Brexit, and the SNP has made clear we will support any steps which would secure Scotland's place in the European Union, in line with the votes of the people of Scotland. But we've also said that if the UK is to leave the EU, by far away the least damaging option is to stay in the single market, which is 8 times bigger than the UK alone and the customs union.
He's been very clear. We know what he's saying. He wants to stay within the European Union. How's he going to get out of the common fisheries policy? And what's he going to do for Scottish fishermen?
Well. Scottish fishing. You know, the reason that Scottish fishing was sold down the river in the 1970s was because Ted Heath made sure that our fishing interests were sold out. And I have to say to him that, you know, in the deal that the government's brought forward, it's the worst of all deals, because in the transition period, the UK would remain in the Commons fisheries policy, but would have no effect on the rules. And if you look at what the European Union has made clear, because you're going to enter into a transition, but you're not holding any cards in terms of the future relationship, and the EU27 have said that the starting position for the negotiations of fishing will be one that they start from the existing quotas. The Scottish fishermen have been sold out, and they've been sold out by the Tories that have duped them that they were going to be taking back control of their waters. Nothing can be further from the truth. I'm now going to make some progress. However, not content with ignoring the Scottish Government's compromise option for 2 years, Theresa May, the Prime Minister, now wants to shut Scotland's voice out entirely. The Prime Minister can't go on ignoring Scotland. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow the Scottish Parliament will debate a cross-party motion that rejects this deal and a no-deal Brexit. Perhaps there are lessons for this place, because at Holyrood, parties have come together against a damaging Brexit, a consensus and a desire to work collectively to defend Scotland's interests. How many of the 13 Tory MPs from Scotland will stand up with us to defend Scotland's interests? Where are they?
Not one.
I think we know the answer from the failure of the Scottish Tory MPs to stand up against the power grab when Westminster voted to take back control from the Scottish Parliament. We saw then when our powers over fishing, farming and the environment were to be trampled all over by Westminster, and yet the Scottish Tories turned a blind eye. Scottish Tories standing silent as Scotland's Parliament, our Parliament, that the people of Scotland voted for in such huge numbers in 1997, had its powers constrained. The Prime Minister boasts that her deal has support, but I say the Prime Minister, her deal does not have the support of the people of Scotland. Mr. Speaker, a poll published earlier this year found that almost 2/3 of Scottish voters believe that the Westminster Government is ignoring their concerns during Brexit negotiations, and there is now more support in Scotland for remaining in the EU than at the time of the 2016 election. According to research for the People's Vote campaign, 66% of Scottish voters support staying in the EU. The Prime Minister, like her predecessors, is out of step with the feelings of the Scottish people. And it's not just Scottish people. Countless experts and professionals right across the UK have said this is a bad deal. Mr. Speaker, why is the Prime Minister not listening? The Prime Minister's proposed deal is unacceptable and it must be defeated in this House. 80,000 jobs will be put directly at risk in Scotland as a result of Brexit. And yeah, I can see ministers shaking their heads. But that's the analysis of the Fraser of Avondale, and indeed the UK government's own economic analysis points to the fact that a no-deal Brexit would damage the Scottish economy, would wipe out more than 8.5% of our GDP. How any government can impose these risks on Scotland is just simply breathtaking. The UK government's intention to end free movement of people will be hugely damaging to our economy.
Correct.
Inward migration has made an overwhelmingly positive contribution to Scotland's economy, meeting our needs for workers in sectors such as health and social care, as well as in the tourism industry in the Highlands and Islands. Any reduction in EU migration could have a serious effect on Scotland's population growth and its demographic composition. In Scotland, all of the projected increase in our population over the next 25 years is due to migration. According to the Scottish Fiscal Commission, with 50% less EU migration, the working age population would decline by almost 1%, and the proportion of children would be declined by 4.3%. This deal totally fails to meet Scotland's distinctive needs.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. Just an example of exactly what he's saying came to my ears today. There is a pilot who works for a Scottish airline who has a choice between having a strong EU Dutch passport or having a UK passport. Having a UK passport will mean he'll have to pay about £10,000 for himself and his wife and his children to stay in the UK, or leave him with a weaker passport, whereas he goes with a Dutch passport and works internationally in the airline industry. This is the very damage that the honourable gentleman is talking about, that this government does not care about. Whatever it will do to the transport infrastructure of the Highlands, they will carry on blindly as they've been going.
No, he's absolutely right. And we must make this point right across Scotland, that there is an existential threat to our living standards, to our workers, and we must make sure that we stop Brexit. And if we can't stop Brexit for the United Kingdom, then we've got to take our own responsibilities to protect Scotland.
Well said, Ian. Good on you.
Mr. Speaker, Brexit uncertainty is already damaging our economy to the tune of £600 per household per year as the value of the pound falls and inflation rises. That's not Project Fear. That has happened. That's what's happened since we had the sheer responsibility of the Vote Leave campaign, with ridiculous statements on the side of a bus promoted by the ex-Foreign Secretary who should be hanging his head in shame.
I think he is.
There is no certainty on the PM's deal on future trading arrangement for goods or services, no certainty on future mobility, no clarity on law, and no guarantee on continued participation in EU funding programmes which support our universities, communities, NGOs and businesses. And uncertainty leads to risks for investment and further risks for our economy. By 2030, under a free trade agreement, GDP would be £9 billion lower than if we stayed in the European Union, equivalent to £1,600 per person in Scotland. That's what Brexit risks. Per year, making the people of Scotland poorer. That's why the Scottish National Party, in all good faith, has offered a compromise. If we're to be dragged out of the European Union against our will, then at the very least, Mr. Speaker, we must remain in the single market and the customs union to protect our economy. Without single market and customs union membership, the future relationship can only be a free trade agreement, introducing barriers to Scottish companies' abilities to trade. This will damage jobs, investment, productivity and earnings. The government's own analysis proves that Brexit is bad for Scotland. Trade volumes, GDP and wages would all fall, while government borrowing and trade costs would increase. All the analysis shows that in a no-deal scenario that it would be catastrophic, and it's likely that the corporate sector in general is not well equipped to deal with a no-deal Brexit.
Correct.
It is more important than ever that we're not faced with a false choice between a bad deal and a no-deal. We need to have more time. We must extend Article 50 and take an alternative route to protect our economy. This deal and no deal are not options. Only those reckless enough to risk economic hardship will back this deal. Despite what the Prime Minister said here today, her own Chancellor agrees with the SNP when he admitted on Radio 4 that in economic terms we will be worse off after Brexit, after leaving the single market. Even more telling, Mr Speaker, is the admission from the Prime Minister herself in the House last week. The Prime Minister said in response to the member from Belfast North, what we want to be able to do is in the future be able to have our own independent trade policy. One of the issues in relation to the backstop is whether or not we would be able to do that, not one of the issues we would want to see continuing the backstop for. So the Prime Minister is clear. There's a concern from this government over their ability to be able to strike and implement free trade deals if the backstop comes into force. Why then is the Prime Minister here arguing that this deal delivers? Mr Speaker, again I ask this House, how could we support a deal and back the government on delivering an outcome that would make our economy smaller and our communities poorer? Mr Speaker, government ministers have tried to spin support in favour of this deal, citing the support from sectors across the United Kingdom. However, let me say this to those who believe that this deal is the only option. It is not, and we deserve better. Yeah. We know that frictionless trade at the border is crucial for Scotland's food and drink exports, but there is no guarantee of this, as under the deal, border checks and controls will depend on the extent of the UK's alignment with EU customs and regulatory regimes. Yet the declaration contains no commitment to a common rulebook on regulation. The SNP believes that our food and drink sector deserves assurance. They deserve cast-iron protections for their industry, not a false binary choice between a no Brexit and a blindfold Brexit. Yet again, another UK Tory government in Westminster has bargained off our fishing sector. Despite what utterances come from Number 10 as false assurances, the UK is reneging on its promises to support Scottish fishing by accepting a link between the UK waters and access to EU markets. Its commitment to a separate fisheries agreement as part of the economic partnership could mean the UK ceding access for EU vessels to UK waters or accepting tariffs and customs barriers on trade in fish, seafood and farmed salmon with the EU. That, Mr Speaker, is not acceptable. This will mean once again Scottish interests being traded off against each other. This is absolutely unacceptable, and those in the Scottish Tories who profess to want to protect Scottish fishermen should hang their heads in shame. If the Tories go through the lobbies to protect this government, they will have once again sold Scotland out for party political gain, and, Mr Speaker, they will not be forgiven for it. The UK government must respect the will of the Scottish people, who voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU. It is, Mr Speaker, a democratic outrage that Scotland has been dragged out of the European Union against its will. The withdrawal agreement sidelines Scotland and sells out our vital national industries. How could any representative in good conscience support such a move? Let me be clear. Next week, the SNP will reject the withdrawal agreement because it will leave Scotland poorer and rips opportunities away from future generations. Does the Prime Minister show any respect for our mandate at all? No. Does this government have respect for the fact that every Scottish local authority voted Remain and the nation voted 62% in favour of staying in the EU? No. Well, Mr Speaker, in Scotland we will make our voices heard once again. Northern Ireland has been given a differential deal that will put Scotland at a competitive disadvantage. There is no reason why a similar arrangement cannot be afforded to Scotland. The SNP will bring forward an amendment to ensure that in the place the voice of Scotland is well and truly heard. Those who claim to be Democrats, those who claim to have respect for the people of Scotland and for the mandate of the Scottish people and the Parliament cannot vote with the UK government on this deal. It is clearer now than ever before that the only way The only way to protect Scotland's interest is to be an independent nation. Mr. Speaker, the First Minister has been very clear that she will set out the next steps in Scotland's future once the terms of the Brexit deal are clear.
Days.
The process of Brexit has demonstrated weaknesses in the UK's constitutional arrangements. Scotland has been ignored, sidelined and undermined through the entire Brexit process. The cost to the people in Scotland of not being independent have been laid bare.
Just look at Ireland.
Mr. Speaker, today is a moment of huge historical significance. A moment that for decades to come, people will remember what this place decided to do if we as public representatives with the responsibility to protect our communities and constituents vote for a deal that will harm and hinder their opportunities, or if we stood up for them. Mr. Speaker, this is no ordinary time in our history, and it is no ordinary time for our politics. Brexit has cast the politics of Westminster into a landscape of crumbling certainties. We are at a defining moment. We must stand up for our constituents. We cannot ignore the economic analysis. We cannot drive blindfolded off the cliff edge. We must take back control in this place. We must have the courage of our convictions and yield the power gifted us to do the right thing. We must stop this deal and this government from railroading recklessly over our rights, our freedoms and the opportunities for our people. There is another way. There is time, and we must take it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know that there's many people across the UK who are very excited about Brexit. We know about the blue passports that they'll be able to hold. There's the new Brexit 50p coin, and there's also the prospect of Empire 2 coming to the fore. But I think the more we learn about the Brexit process, the more that more people are realising that we're going to lose more than we could possibly ever gain. In my own constituency, I know that we voted 60% to remain within the EU, and recent polls have shown that that figure has actually grown from the 60% to somewhere 68, 69%. So as people realise the real impact on their lives, on their jobs in Scotland, then I think the hardening of the pro-EU vote is actually coming to the fore. But I really want to focus my comments tonight and my remarks on the impact of the UK leaving the EU and what impact that will have on the important areas of defence and security. In my view, the Government has drastically underestimated the negative consequences of Brexit on our ability to maintain safety and security across the UK without the full cooperation of our European counterparts and the ability of our defence industries to trade and operate freely across the single market. We have strong competitive defence industry here in the UK, with such firms as Babcock, BAE Systems, Rolls-Royce, successfully fulfilling MOD orders for a number of years, and even more newer companies coming into the work stream. These firms, like many others, have built a vast breadth of expertise and capability, and we should be doing everything we can to preserve that level of skill that we have in our industries. While the withdrawal agreement does offer short-term stability to the industry, it's the long-term that where they don't provide any assurances to ensure that just-in-time supply chains and trading arrangements across the EU will be maintained. We must also consider the support currently provided to the defence industry, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, in the form of European structural and investment funds and through the European Investment Bank. The Government must commit to continuing or replacing this level of support. Without it, we face further job losses in the dockyards like Rosyth in my constituency, and the gradual depletion of these skills from an industrial landscape completely. This would be an economic travesty, which I am sure neither members of this House or our constituents wish to see happen. In the report published by the Public Accounts Committee in March on MOD acquisition and support of defence equipment, the committee advised that the Department needs to safeguard the interests of the British industry after we have left the EU. The government have been warned time and time again that it must protect our defence sector from the economic calamity of leaving the EU, and I urge the Prime Minister and the ministers who are sitting on the front bench now to take heed before it's too late. As a member of the Public Accounts Committee, I co-led an evidence session just yesterday with witnesses from the Ministry of Defence on the Defence Equipment Plan over the next 10 years. The National Audit Office reports that the equipment plan remains unaffordable, with the MOD itself admitting that there are somewhere between £7 billion and £14.8 billion of black hole in that budget. Now, why is that affected by Brexit? Because we have established, even under the Prime Minister's deal, that the UK will be worse off under the current arrangements, and the government itself accepts this. And almost every economic commentator who has produced anything of note also recognises that the public finances of the UK PLC will be in a much worse state beyond Brexit than it is at the moment. So given that the MOD is already struggling to realise its ambitions with the current budget, how will it cope to another blow to the economy when we leave the EU, especially if it's a no-deal scenario? And that is even before we start going anywhere near possible negative currency implications. With the question marks already hanging over where the axe will fall in the equipment plan in order to bring it into balance, the situation with Brexit puts at risk our defence capability. There has been much that's been debated around our fishing industry, but what's been missing more than anything is discussions and the focus of securing our waters post-Brexit. Protecting the North Atlantic in particular is a key strategic importance, not only to safeguard fisheries, our oil and gas reserves and renewables, but protect us from external threats. The MOD currently has a total of 19 Royal Navy escort ships, which is a historic low, whilst there are 3 Type 26 frigates on order BA systems in the Clyde, and that gives us nowhere near enough vessels to adequately protect our waters. The government, another area of huge importance when it comes to defence is in the area of research and development. As a member of the EU, we currently benefit from numerous opportunities for collaborative research with our European partners through bodies such as the European Defence Agency. I recognise that the possible for non-EU countries to participate in the EDA, but urge the government to ensure that provision is made to retain as much access as possible to these and to other defence funds as they become available. One such project is Operation Atalanta, the highly successful EU-led anti-piracy operation off the Horn of Africa, which the UK played a leading role. At the height of the Somali piracy in 2011, 736 hostages and 32 ships were being held by the pirates. By April 2017, that number had dropped to 0. And this demonstrates, I think, the value of joint EU efforts to tackle global security threats, which we must continue to be part of. The Galileo satellite system is another collaborative project that the EU is at risk of being excluded from as part of Brexit. And while the government has put forward proposals for continued participation in Galileo as part of the wider security relationship, there is no guarantee that this will be accepted. In conclusion, when the Prime Minister has put forward the prospect of a deal or no deal, it really leaves a multitude of threats that face our defence and security industry. And a recent article by Malcolm Chalmers, Deputy Director of RUSI, he suggested that in security terms, the benefits of membership combining both shared decision-making and operational effectiveness cannot be replicated under the proposed deal. And he goes on to say, if the UK were to leave the EU without a deal, it would have severe and immediate consequences for the UK's ability to combat crime and terrorism. Can I finally say, Mr Speaker, that I can tell the House about my recent visit to Kudos, Torryburn and St Margaret's primary schools, and we discussed Brexit at length with 12 and 13-year-olds there. Perhaps a cruel irony is that in Brexit came about, or rather the EU came about, through the end of 2 world wars, which really took many lives, and that's the kind of legacy that we're about to leave our children. And probably the saddest part of Brexit entirely is the fact that we're ignoring the peace dividend that we've had for the last several decades. Thank you.